So let's take a look at why is death bad in some detail. But I wanted to just emphasize or reiterate that there's really one question here. And the question is the question of the asymmetry problem. And the asymmetry problem is really a question of whether or not there's any significant difference between prenatal and posthumous non-existence. At the end of the day, what these authors want to prove is that it's not irrational to treat them differently. So they've got to come up with some kind of argument for that. That it's really kind of a rescue operation for our intuitive sense that death is worse than not yet being born, which seems in a way obvious, but it turns out not to be obvious. So they are much, they are very much in Nagel's territory here. They want to argue that death can be a bad thing for a person, that Epicurus is wrong about that. That despite Nagel's accepting and their accepting of the general Epicurean view that death means non-existence, that death is the absolute end of the person and therefore is not something that can be experienced or anything that will result in suffering, that nevertheless it's a bad thing. And the general strategy on the part of Nagel is to say that death is a bad thing insofar as it is a loss of goods. That is not it doesn't have any positive features, and that it hurts or entails suffering, but that someone's death represents a loss of future goods. Although that loss is not one that's experienced by the loser, right? Which is Nagel's problem, that we saw in last thing we read, Nagel's death, that despite the fact that the loss is not one that the loser is aware of, and the loser does not suffer because of it, the loser does not become unhappy, but it's still perfectly sound to say that a bad thing happened to them. That is really the big question of Nagel's essay. The big question of this essay, as we saw, is the asymmetry problem, which was dealt in a very summary fashion by Nagel, dismissed by Nagel, and not really taken very seriously by him, and it's taken much more seriously by these authors. Nagel, if you see the bottom of page 214, after describing the asymmetry problem, they say one way to respond to the challenge and thus defend the Nagelian explanation of death's badness is to say that whereas one could logically have lived longer, it is logically impossible that one should have been born much earlier. That's Nagel's way of saying it, is that it doesn't make any sense to lament the fact that we weren't born earlier than we were. If we go back to, I hope I can find it. Yeah, if we go back to this, the left side of the line is a certain time, right? and the right side of the line is a certain time, and in between are the years of our lives. So it makes sense to lament that we died, or it makes sense to say that something bad happened to somebody because they died here at this point, rather than farther to the right. But it doesn't make any sense, according to Nagel, to say that something bad happened to somebody because they were born at this point and not further to the left. That's the essence, because Nagel says if they had been born much further to the left, years to the left, they wouldn't be the same person. So it makes no sense to say that they were deprived of any of the goods of life because they hadn't been born yet, because that is impossible. Because it's impossible to have been born much earlier than you were. I mean, it's possible to be born a few minutes or a few days before you were. If you had, been born 10 minutes earlier than you were, you'd be the same person. But if you had been born 10 years before you were, that doesn't make any sense. You couldn't have been the same person. So the beginning of Bruckner and Fischer's essay really is, though, that they don't necessarily think that that's true. They don't accept it, right? This is the substance of what they say on the top of page 215. They say it is not clear that it is logically impossible that an individual should have been born substantially earlier than he actually was. It is not at all clear, for instance, that Socrates, the very same Socrates, couldn't logically have come into being 10 years earlier than he in fact did. That is, at least it's conceivable. It may not be biologically possible, but logically, they're saying there's nothing logically absurd about saying that Socrates could have been born 10 years earlier than he was. That is, there's nothing contradictory about that. So they just assume that he could have been, and that is they think that Nagel doesn't make really any argument that doesn't make sense, so it stands. So the asymmetry problem stands, and again, if we go back to our little chart here, not chart, little representation. Sorry. The idea is that if we say that death is bad because it's a deprivation of possible goods, we say things like this. Let's say that the right side of this line is Jim's death in like 1950. And Jim was hit by a bus in 1950. Thereby, he was deprived of all the goods he would have experienced if that line had continued to the right. Let's say that if he hadn't been hit by a bus in 1950, he would have died in 1970 and would have experienced 20 years of the goods of life. And therefore, his death was a bad thing for him because it deprived him of that. Well, okay, holding the right side of the line steady and saying he dies in 1950, let's say he was born in 1900. Well, he could have been born in 1890 is the idea, and that because he wasn't born in 1890 and rather was born 10 years later in 1900, he was deprived of the goods of life between 1890 and 1900 had he been alive. That is, if he could have died 10 years or 20 years later, and thereby we say that he was deprived of all the goods of life he would have experienced during those years, if he could have been born 10 years earlier, again, still dying in 1950, then the fact that he was born in 1900 rather than 1890 represents a deprivation of the goods that he would have experienced in those 10 years. That's the idea. Yeah. They say here, again, what page are we on here, right? 214. Yeah. He says, but a problem emerges. We intuitively think that it is appropriate to have asymmetric attitudes towards prenatal non-existence and death. We think that it is reasonable to regard death as a bad thing in a way in which prenatal non-existence is not. If death involves bad experiences in an afterlife, then this asymmetry could be explained. But we are assuming here that death's badness is not experienced as bad by the individual who dies. That is, it's merely a loss of goods, not anything that's positively bad. If this is so, how can we explain the intuitive asymmetry between prenatal and posthumous non-existence? Both periods are, after all, experiential blanks. That is, there's no experience. We don't have any experience before we're born. We won't have any experience after we die. And it seems that prenatal non-existence constitutes a deprivation in a sense analogous to that in which death is a deprivation. That's the key point. If a person had been born earlier than he actually was born, then he would have had more of the good things in life. Now, what they're saying is basically that does make sense. And it would seem that if it does make sense, and if it is true, then our asymmetric treatment of these two periods of non-existence is irrational. So how do they try to solve? Okay, so then we have to look and see, how is it that they try to solve the asymmetry problem? And they start with Derek Parfit's example of the very strange example of the person who wakes up in the hospital. So why don't we start there for our next and hopefully last video. But that really is the beginning of their suggestion for how the asymmetry problem should be solved.